Hey everybody, I thought I would just kind of do an initial impression and review of the Holley Sniper sheet metal intake that's the dual quad for the small block Ford. It's a very interesting intake, and I'm kind of experimenting with it to see what it'll do, but I thought before I start modifying it too much, I would at least make a quick video because there's not too many of them around, and I think there's definitely some questions that I had when I was trying to find one. Currently, they're all back ordered and whatnot, but I was actually able to find this one used. So the first impression of this intake manifold is it's kind of a weird looking intake. Um, it is sheet metal and it's got the cool weld, beads run and all that kind of stuff. But it's definitely not a Wilson or a high-end manifold. But what's also important to keep in mind is instead of paying $2,500 to $3,000 for a sheet metal intake, these new are about I believe $550. I was able to find this one used, technically never run, but a guy changed his mind and I was able to pick it up for $300. So I figured maybe it's worth a shot. So the first thing that I've done, because I have hood clearance issues, I was looking for a dual quad intake that I can run Holley carburetors on. A lot of the dual quad intakes, like the Performer RPM air gap and the older Offenhauser intakes, things like that, the carb spacing is too narrow, and you have to run Edelbrock or Carter carburetors. And I'm a Holley guy, and so I only really had two options. There was this intake, the old original tunnel rams from Wyand, that sit up really high, but I have a lot of hood clearance issues. Or you can go to the Ford dual plane, dual quad intake, which is still made by Blue Thunder. The other issue with those, the dual quads, they were like $800-900. If you find an original Ford one, some people on eBay are asking quite a pretty penny for them. So I thought, this one at least ought to be worth a shot for $300 and see what happens. So overall height, the first modification I did is I milled these pads down at my machine shop. When I got it, they sat up pretty high, and I brought them down to about 1/4 of an inch, so I can still have enough threads to tighten the carbs down without any problems. So I'm trying to get as much hood clearance as I possibly can out of it. So that was the first mod, but they did sit up quite a bit higher, kind of up in this range, up in here. If you don't have hood clearance issues, maybe that's not necessarily as big of an issue. The other thing that I thought was really interesting when I was evaluating the intake, I'll see if we can get maybe a little bit of light in here, is kind of like what you would expect with a sheet metal intake. You're going to have these, beads run on all of the seams. But the interesting part about it is how big of a bump that is when it comes to the transition down into the runner. I guess you could kind of debate that either way. A lot of the sheet metal intakes are made with almost like a velocity stack or a cone that comes up into the plenum. They seem to work really well. Other people would argue that something like this high up in the runner isn't going to really affect the cylinder head. However, I've seen some pretty dramatic increases in porting the old-fashioned tunnel rams by blending this area here, and that's quite a ways up the runner. So my personal preference is I'm probably going to come in here and smooth all this out to see if we can't get a little bit better flow into the plenum. The other thing about this intake that's really kind of interesting as far as the design is concerned is this plenum. I don't know what the best angle to kind of see on that. Is a big plenum and a short runner. Again, I'll be interested to kind of see how that affects power if it does. But it's definitely, with the height, you've got a runner there that's not even 2 inches long, but a big fat plenum on it. The other thing I was surprised at with the intake, and I'll see if I can tilt this up here, is that these ports, even though the intake is rated for fairly high RPM range, the ports are quite small. I usually run this gasket on my small block Ford. It's the 1262, and you can see how much of a smaller port that is than the intake gasket. So if you're running, a large CC intake runner cylinder head, that may be something to be considering, because normally if you had an intake like this, you might consider blending this out, gasket matching, and then blending it up the runner. But the problem is with the sheet metal intake, there's no meat there to really do that. So, if anything, you could maybe blend out on this this piece of aluminum here that mates to the cylinder head, but you're still dealing with a runner that tends to be a little bit on the small side. However, like any tunnel ram, I guess, you've definitely got a straight shot at the carburetors. And so I'll be really interested to see, how this thing kind of works out on the dyno as compared to like a stock single 4-barrel intake that might be a performance-oriented deal. But some people like the big beads on the welds. I'm personally going for a little bit different look, so I'm going to also do some modifications to the outside of the intake. But my hope is that I can fit 2 Holleys on my small block Ford and fit it underneath the stock hood and still get good performance out of this thing from like 3,000 to 8,000. And so I'm just going to spend some time cleaning it up, and then I'll try to do maybe a video a little bit later on as to other things that I find as we kind of move on through this intake. But it's definitely an interesting piece for $300. I don't know that it's necessarily a bad one. It's definitely not a $3,000 intake. But I guess we'll find out, if it's worth it or not.